Workplace Education Manitoba, and I'm so happy to be your host and support for today's webinar, Handling Pandemic Challenges. I'd like to bring to your attention some support links in the chat box, as well as 3 icons on the top of your screen, the emojis, as well as the question box and the telephone. I understand that some people are on the telephone as well. And in your chat box, there are 2 links. One for an email address, it's jlorusso@wem.mb.ca, and that is for you to use if you have any trouble with support or have any questions. As well as the person who's on the telephone, my telephone number for text only is 204-770-4864 if you have any questions or having some technical concerns. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce our instructor today. She has a lot to cover, so I know we're going very quickly. Her name is Rochelle Amy, amazing lady from Essential Skills practitioner. And Rochelle, you have the screen. Thank you.
Thank you, Jessica, and good morning. Great to have you all join us. I know one thing we're doing is we're handling pandemic challenges together from all over the province. So I'm so glad you could take this time to invest in yourself and just look at this whole craziness with a new perspective and probably an old perspective. There will be a few things we cover that'll be familiar to you and some that will be new, and so you'll want to have a pen and jot a few notes because we will go quickly. We're so thankful that Workplace Education Manitoba is able to provide essential skill training. There's 9 essential skills. Today we're going to touch on these ones here, and we always like to thank our funders for the support in making this possible. At the very bottom of your screen is our website, and I welcome you and encourage you to check it out because very soon we'll be announcing on the website what is ahead for July and August, so we'd love to have you join us for some of those sessions. Maybe this is an expression that describes how you felt the last several months. What is happening? And what's ahead? What does that look like? And a lot of the looking ahead involves the looking behind and rethinking the way we've shaped our crisis management plans. Of course, we were told right away, stay calm, we're in this together. We heard lots of comforting words, and really it was something new because we had talked in our workplaces before about handling regional outbreaks and regional emergencies. And this is probably the first time you were put to the test with seeing what happens globally and in all kinds of countries, economies, and workplaces. And it's interesting because right here in Manitoba, Judy Murphy of Safety Services Manitoba, she had her team right away do a run analysis. And it was very interesting because they determined to instantly throw all your crisis management plans out the window. It's not what it used to be. And what you wrote down as your 10-year plan suddenly changed. We're working on a 2-day plan now. So there was a lot of reinventing of the crisis management plans and what that would look like. And then there became new urgencies and really managing near-term more than long-term. And crisis management plans typically in the past have been written in those 2 stages that we're dealing with near-term and we're dealing with long-term. But most of our crisis response practitioners during this pandemic have come up with a run analysis to say, actually, the list got a lot shorter and we're dealing with near-term emergencies, changes, and adaptations that we hadn't in the past. And what ends up happening is we feel all this impact happening to us. Probably the first few days, it was kind of peaceful. It was like, wow, okay, the world just slowed down. You know, cancellation of sports, cancellation of meetings, cancellation of travel. It was like, wow, this is peaceful. And then impact starts to set in. And we see that there's these 3 layers of impact. There's sort of that big picture on what your lens for the world around you looks like, your values, your hopes, your beliefs about that. And then there's that smaller image of you within your company and workplace, you know, that professional you, the hat you wear with your coworkers and with your responsibilities. And then there's that real individual you that writes the story of what's happening in your life. And as we look at these three levels of who gets impacted and how they're impacted, it helps us to map out a way forward so that we can deal with the situation based on which one of these lenses we're looking through. So if we go ahead and look at that first one, that first level impact, if you personally, you know, we often hear people say, you got to put on your oxygen mask before you help out the person next to you. And we think of that in terms of an airplane crashing, don't we? Like that's an emergency to save your life when something bad happens. And I just throw a challenge out to you today. What if actually you saw an oxygen mask in this way, that it wasn't just to prevent you from something terrible happening, but it was to enable you to reach a higher height than what you could do otherwise, not having the oxygen mask. So to do that and to have some self-assessment, self-awareness, and self-care during a time of pandemic, there's so many factors to consider. And honestly, we could do a tidbit about every one of these, and we have some that are specifically geared to these topics. So I do encourage you to check out our different offerings. But really, these are the types of things you want to be jotting down and doing a little more research in, because being able to do self-assessment on how you are mentally, physically, emotionally, and knowing what your triggers are, which things push the buttons at any time, not just in a crisis time. Knowing what your biggest values are. You might have, you know, 3 to 5 core values that drive you. Well, what are they? Because your perspective on pandemic is going to be tied to those, and those core values are going to be different than the person sitting in the chair next to you. What's your unique strengths and contributions? And your greatest hope cannot be underestimated. That sounds sometimes like flowery language for people, but you probably have a hope for your company or your career or your environment, and that's secret to you. Well, you need to identify what that is, articulate it, put it in writing. If you know your learning style, you'll understand why when you're receiving different news and different policies and interacting with people, why it matters. This is especially huge during the pandemic time where people became separated, because some of us have learning styles that really rely on the energy, the conversation, and the face-to-face interaction with other people. So if you know that about yourself, you can incorporate adaptive changes to accommodate that. Your particular roles, availabilities, your capacity, and your self-awareness. These are things, again, you jot these down, because these are you can dig in to every single one of these and come up with itemized lists about what that looks like. But knowing and understanding what that looks like for you changes that perspective on the oxygen mask. It's not just I'm just grasping to try to get air so I can just help someone, but it puts you in a position where you say, hey, right now in this, I need the oxygen, but it's actually to leverage me and take me to another place, a better place and a stronger place. Now, when we feel a particular amount of pressure, when we feel a particular amount of crisis, this is a great acronym to just help you not screw up. This is one, I love reminding myself of this. Now, if you've ever been pregnant or had a baby, like, you know, give me your emoji to show me you're feeling it. We learned this. You don't cut all your hair off when you're pregnant. You don't do drastic changes and move houses or whatever, because when you're hungry, angry, lonely, or tired, you make different decisions than you would otherwise make. So the self-management and the self-care of how you're navigating through a crisis that's external to you, or navigating through one that might be personal, if we put this measure in place, it helps us not make the types of decisions and major changes that could impede us down the road when we're not in that crisis mode. So knowing that we've had our own self affected and our own self sort of taxed and pulled to capacity. Another level of self that we want to look at is who you are in your company. And it's so interesting because if someone were to ask you, hey, nice to meet you, what is it you do? You may have answered that question. I know I would have answered that question a little differently a few months ago than how I answer it now, because some of the day-to-day changes, some of the realities of what's necessary changes, and you hone down right away what it is necessary in your company. So when you're looking at that perspective of who you are as the professional, I would suggest there's two different camps. There's the camp in non-crisis time of policies and procedures and how the workplace works and what you sell and what products work and how you interact with vendors and stakeholders. And then during pandemic and crisis times, there's actually realities that are different. So we find that the policies move and change, and the current reality will sometimes trump what the normal policy is. So a good example of that would be in a retail environment or an office environment that's open to patrons. Visitors used to be given the highest priority, right? The door was open, the seats were there was a real welcome, that the whole idea of warmth and hospitality is absolutely huge. And then that might have been the company's #1 policy, what that person experiences face to face. And then the pandemic doors slammed shut, and suddenly there's this harsh reality. I was actually in a store yesterday and an employee was yelling at one of the customers because they weren't standing on the blue dot. They were beside the blue dot. And so those policies that that store used to have on how to interact with customers completely changed, and there's a new reality. So adapting and recognizing that a reality might be creating a new policy that nobody's written down, and they're not calling it a policy. And so understanding what adaptive leadership looks like is so critical. Now, adaptive leadership, this is where we're going in leadership teaching in this era we're in. It's no longer about just excellence and values and performance. We're really talking about adaptive leadership. And the pandemic just sort of launched that high speed. What was already forming as the new conversation about leadership, it went into high gear. And so understanding that how you adapt and how you change, there's not a rigidity with your crisis plans anymore, but there's a flexibility in how you're handling them. And I know that a lot of us don't actually wear uniforms to work. Some may, might be a requirement of your type of profession. But when I say uniform, I'm really talking about the figurative uniform that you wear. So you have your own self, your own values, the own interests that you represent. But what does that look like when you put that uniform on for the company? So the you that's representing the company that you work for, do you have a level of awareness, not only what you're going through, but can you articulate what your company is going through? Have you thought about the risks? Have you thought about the changes? Have you thought about the adaptations? Because you are like that one piece of a puzzle making up the much bigger picture. So the you in your uniform, what are you aware to that your company is experiencing? There's some strife in the workplaces right now. People are judging who's working harder, who's not, what are people actually doing from home, why are some people choosing not to work at all, and that whole debate rages about who's doing what. And I want to give you a word of encouragement about whoever your leader is. If there is someone above you on the totem pole, as it were, this is probably what you're seeing. You are probably seeing just this peaceful duck floating down the river, and they might even be a little bit disconnected from you and not offering a ton of input or a ton of feedback or a ton of dialogue about how to process. And remember that that's the glimpse you get to see. What you don't see is the duck's not floating down the river at all. It's actually swimming upstream against the current, and underneath it's paddling like mad, and you can't see those little feet going. So my encouragement to you in time of pandemic is to recognize sometimes what you see on the top is not what's brewing underneath the surface, and particularly the you in your uniform as a part of your company, or you with that hat you wear, as it were, in your company. You've got to dig a little bit deeper, because during the times of crisis, we're putting out fires. We don't have time to unpack what everyone's going through and what it looks like. So change your perspective. What's happening below the water? And maybe it's not something anybody has time to work through with you on, but you certainly can extend a measure of grace and try to figure out which way is the water going, which way are they paddling, and how do I get on board to go the same direction? There's a great resource online. A gal named Melissa Agnes has her own website and ebooks about handling crisis management. And it's so key. She talks about how action and communication have to happen in tandem. If they're not in tandem, you're not managing your crisis at all. So there's so many tips and opportunities that she gives us to think about how to handle a crisis. I know the second one on the screen is particularly of interest to people in our current pandemic. We look at how is our data managed? Where is it found? How do we access it? And how do we store copies in remote accessibility so that we all can work from different places? And not mentioned there is, of course, how to deal with the whole privacy and the PIPEDA Act, and how do we actually manage the information based on where it is. So recognizing that you're making decisions that are happening in individual waffle boxes, and each one of these things is its own box inside the waffle, but none of them are the full waffle. So you're doing all these crisis management things one square at a time, recognizing that they do affect each other. And of course, she mentions that social media can be absolute gasoline, and that's critical. We're watching people lose their jobs right now because we just don't even know what kind of fires are brewing on social media. So that's a key one to stick in your back pocket, that, you know, when this ends, or whatever the future holds, we're recognizing that we've done that halt activity even professionally. We're not doing a lot when we're hungry, angry, lonely, or tired. That impact was on you as a professional. That impact was on you in the company you. And that impact absolutely impacts who you are in your view of the world. And it cannot be underestimated that we do have our own world views, and so many things went into shaping this and developing who we are. And as we watch the world change, we recognize, hey, wait a sec, I'm feeling the stress, or I'm feeling a rub, or I'm feeling anxiety, and it's something bigger that I can't control. It's not a little waffle box inside of a waffle. It's like the whole waffle, and I don't know how to handle that. Well, understanding again what those core values were that you have, and recognizing that as you see changes in the world, there might be a rub on that. We got to think about diversity with our worldview, because where we are looking through our binoculars looks totally different if you're somewhere else looking through binoculars. And you know, my children have this set of binoculars for watching wildlife, and it's so interesting because they put them on, they zoom in, they can focus on the wildlife and just see detail and things that you can't see without them. And then they hand them over to me, or hand them over to the next person. And to try to find the wildlife when the binoculars are dialed in already, it's actually a challenge, and you have to reset it when you put it on. So recognizing that based on where you're standing and what you're looking at, the worldview can look quite different, and you might have a completely different baseline of believing whatever you believe, or understanding whatever you understand. Probably you've seen this. This lovely picture of two seniors talking together and gazing in each other's eyes. Probably you've seen this. And maybe you didn't see two seniors looking at each other. Maybe you saw two people relaxing and listening to guitar music and someone in the background observing, and a totally different perspective on what the fabrics look like, because they start to look like a cultural fabric in that setting. So depending on our perspective and our worldview, we might be looking at the exact same target as someone else, but identifying all different details, a whole different message about it based on where we're looking from and what our baseline was. And so recognizing and being able to have an appreciation for a different perspective actually helps give us some grace to be able to go through it alongside someone with a different baseline. Now, once we articulate that, yeah, I'm feeling all these pressures, the me personal, the company me, and the worldview me, I feel the pressures, and there's so much to deal with. How do I deal with them? Well, to bring those three big things into three funnels to be able to handle it, we want to look at pacing, planning, and proofing. The pace might be the hardest thing, right? you taking care of you can actually be the last thing you want to do, because you want to put out the fire first. But to have the stamina to go the distance, the taking care of the you, is absolutely critical. And it's funny, a lot of people are talking about different medicines and things that can help. And then during this particular outbreak, and then I talked to someone who's a high-level fitness person, instructor, teacher, and so on. And they said, man, where's all the teaching about building your immune system? And they know it, and they're teaching their clients, and people are working on that. And I thought, yeah, absolutely. The whole idea of taking the control on building up your immune system. What does that look like for you? But what does it look like for you in terms of even recovery time? Are you sleeping? What's your environment? Maybe you've been forced to leave the office and work at home. And I was talking to a colleague about, what does that look like? Now I got to clean my office space. And so these ideas of being able to pace yourself for the distance, so critical. In managing time, because we identified that the crisis plan got thrown out the window, and now we're dealing with urgent, and the rules changing every day. Delegation is so critical. What can be shared? What parts of teams and collaboration need to happen that maybe are totally outside the box? Maybe you relate to your IT department now in a way that's very different than what you related to before. And are you creating margin in your life? Do you have time to breathe in between? Some apps are helpful for that. Some people are on technology overload, but that's absolutely worth exploring. And instead of just looking at your app store, do the research on the thing that's giving you the stress. So if meal planning is a thing, and you have certain ways that you want to plan recovery for your body, search up if there's apps for that particular thing, and you'll get all kinds of blogs and so on helping you find apps to help with productivity and just efficiency and accountability, of course. And recognizing that when we're thinking of our mindsets and our own health, it's worth mentioning that depression does feel like something, and you can notice changes in behavior. And so having the people that you can talk to, this may not be the same people that you work with, because what you're experiencing in your workplace, even in the same department, remember, you're representing that bigger picture. It's not just only you. Multitasking is impossible. Throw that out the window. Crisis management and navigating through pandemic is about dealing with one thing at a time and creating margin in between. We used to write crisis response plans that would last for about 5 years in a company. Now they're getting written every 24 hours. So really instead of focusing so much on what did my old plan look like, it's looking at where am I creating margin so that I have time to plan, because that's going to be a part of my day-to-day life. And when it becomes overwhelming like this, and there's so many big picture questions to ask, sometimes you break them down into one a week or one a day that you're tackling them day by day. Looking around, trying to figure out what to do. What do I go to? What are the rules? Well, these are some of the places that you've already had them written down. These are some of the places that say exactly what you should be looking to first. And I find the needs assessment study one of the most fascinating ones, because it doesn't usually fit into the crisis response plan. But if your company has done a needs assessment, that's probably very close to the same in a pandemic. It's the same needs need to happen, but the methods and the routes to get there just look differently during this time. So if you're familiar with SWOT analysis or not, this is something to jot down. When you're looking at the company you, what are your strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats? And then taking that and internalizing it so that you're also dealing with the personal you and the worldview you. What are your own strengths and weaknesses and opportunities and challenges that relate to you in your particular workplace, dealing with the product that you deal with within your company or your team or your sphere of influence and so on. And if there's one thing that we're hearing over and over, it's that somebody's going, you know, who moved the cheese? Who moved the cheese? Somebody moved the cheese. And the rules all changed. And so recognizing they didn't only change for you. You weren't targeted to throw you off kilter that you should have them all changed. There really is a collective exhaustion going on, that rules changed for what the email best practices are. Rules changed in terms of what you could handle technology-wise. There's people that are exhausted over Zoom or being online, right? Like there's just this exhaustion that happens from being on. And suddenly you find you may still have the chain of command. You might still report to the exact same supervisor, but maybe you have an unspoken new supervisor. Maybe someone is running at capacity, so they've passed someone new to you to deal with. And literally, some companies are locking up the toilet paper because of the crisis. So recognizing, hey, this is the part where everybody got impacted, and it's not just you, but you know, someone's hidden the key to the toilet paper storage cabinet now because we're in a totally different environment. One thing my former company taught me is they wrote not their mission statement first, they wrote their ends policy first. Meaning you can Google that and do a little research on an ends policy, but it's basically saying, what does it need to look like at the end if we're successful? And then let's write a policy based on that. And this is something my dad taught me. I was actually out with him in a boat about a week ago. I caught my first master angler, so that was super fun. But my dad taught me this years and years ago, boating together. When we set out to go somewhere, it's so tempting to look ahead to where you want to go. But wherever we've launched, we always look back. And we look back from all different distances. So when we first leave the dock, we look back. When we're quite far out, a couple hundred meters out, we look back, and you start to get this different perspective of what will success look like. I need to know what it looks like to get back to that dock. And so if you don't turn around and look backwards when you're boating further and further away, you'll miss that there's flagpoles and cell towers and houses and docks that you can look for to be able to navigate your way back. Of course, fish finders made that a little easier, but being able to look at that target and then back up, and say, what in the end would success look like? That's huge for right now. Even to say, what would success this summer look like? And if you grew up in a kitchen like my grandma had, you know about this time. You know that when we talk about proofing, we're not talking about proofreading. We're talking about creating the right environment and the right time to let the right things happen. And so this is a great picture of what used to happen in my grandma's house every single weekend, preparing for the whole family gathering. And when we give ourselves that time and the right environment to be able to think and reflect, we recognize that actually Growth comes out of trauma in a way that we could never even imagine. And it can be quite beautiful and quite profound. And one of the ways to grow that tolerance for uncertainty is to practice it, to do things like not asking for instant messages on text, to do things like going for a challenging hike, because they found that in the previous challenges that our generations have gone through, PTSD is a thing. And so you need to look ahead and be prepared for that. Right now, plan your tolerance for your mental health. So you're giving yourself challenges that you can't just solve instantly. And it takes practice every day, every week to do that, to walk through challenges that you can't solve yourself. A friend of mine going through a tragic divorce once said this, and I don't think it was original to her, but it was absolutely beautiful, that we can't really get our whole picture and our whole analysis based on the one chapter that we're currently in. So take this reflection with you as you go today. There was a you that was pre-pandemic. There's a you that's in it right now, and there's going to be a you after. And which tools are you going to put at work now? Or which goals are you going to put at play? Or which core values are you going to really hone and refine? And most of these things truthfully come by writing it down. It won't happen by thinking about it, but by writing it down and recognizing that there's a you in development that's going to come through this stronger and smarter and more prepared. And how we write our crisis prevention or crisis management plans for the next pandemic are going to look totally different than what we had so far. Encourage you to visit us at weminterlake.ca and see what we have ahead for the summer. Thank you for joining us today. I want to sign off and just respect your time that you've shared with us. And my hope for you is that you'll come through this stronger and braver. Thank you, Jessica.
Thank you, Rochelle. It was a great pleasure having you today, and the content was amazing. I like the fact that you brought up HALT and what would success this summer look like, because we are in difficult times or unprecedented times. So your webinar today was well needed. Please again give Rochelle Amy an emoji of applause. She did an amazing job. And I'd like to thank all the participants for joining us today. And again, I'm going to encourage you to go to weminterlake.ca to look at their roundup or next webinars they're going to be having for the summer. Thank you so much, and we look forward to seeing you again on Tuesday.